Welcome to the Endure Hunt podcast. Join me as I share my experiences as an emergent hunter, offer advice on how to overcome challenges, and pursue your passion for hunting. If this is your first time listening, I am your host, Andrew Lukosevic. I started hunting 6 years ago and I got bit by the Western bug and hunting in general. And it's something that I think about all the time, and I'm hoping to share with all of you who are listening. This episode is one that is near and dear to my heart because I got a special guest, Chris Smith of the Wild Vittles Podcast, on, and we're going to talk all about wild game cooking, food, how to eat it, processing, all of this stuff that tends to not get the limelight and spotlight on social media, but is very, very much worth talking about, in my opinion. And I think Chris would agree with that. I just want to say thank you for coming on, Chris. Appreciate you coming on and talking about wild game with me.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate the opportunity. As it is similar to what you said, it's a passion project for me. The podcast is really all about me trying to help educate people to be better wild game cooks because I think it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. We got connected through a mutual friend in Carrie Beeson. For those who are unfamiliar, I've done 2 podcasts with him now. So if you're a regular listener of Endure Hunt and you don't know who Carrie is, I'll be shocked. But he is the host of the Saltiac Outdoors podcast. Great podcast. We got connected through Carrie. I actually just did an episode with you that will be coming out here soon. I want to start by just let's dive into your background a little bit. So you're in Texas now, but you're originally from
Mm-hmm.
Oklahoma. You still
Mm-hmm.
do a little bit of deer hunting up there, if I'm not mistaken. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess who is Chris Smith? How did you get here and where you are today?
Yeah, although I'm not a youngster anymore, I describe myself as a farm kid. I grew up in Southwest Oklahoma, and my family came to Oklahoma really, when Oklahoma was founded. My great grandfather came and rented the place and started kind of building a family farm in the early 1900s. My grandfather and my father were there, and I was not raised on the farm. We lived in town, but I spent almost all of my childhood out there, and it was a lot of working, but it's also a lot of hunting and fishing. And I'm not a sports guy because my dad wasn't a sports guy, but I learned all about hunting and fishing, and then I was working around livestock and crops, and so it all kind of meshed together. And as an offshoot out of that, I just have always had just this, I mean, extreme love of hunting, fishing, and outdoors. And I don't know if you, I'm a lot older than you, Andrew, so you may not know this country song. But there's a country song by Barbara Mandrell that I was country before country was cool. I feel like I was hunting and fishing before hunting and fishing was cool. It was before everybody like the Joe Rogans and everybody were doing it. I was doing it. My friends thought I was crazy. They're like, dude, you're doing this all the time. And I'm like, yeah, that's, my perfect vision of life is getting to hunt and fish as much as possible. On the kind of more personal side, of course, I'm married. I think I was telling you the other day, I've been married 30 years this year in our anniversary, about in May. Have 2 grown daughters, and we're empty nesters now, which affords me more time to go out hunting and fishing and have time for my own podcast now. And I'm into kind of business and finance, and so in my personal work, I'm actually in kind of an accounting finance manager for one of the major oil companies. And so I'm fortunate in my business life to have also time, as a long career with a company, you get more latitude with vacation and things like that. So started consistent with you going out west. I think about 2018. I think we started the same year on that. So that's kind of me. But if there's an opportunity to do anything outside hunting or fishing, I'm doing it almost every weekend. And although I have kind of my core activities, I'm up for anything. Like I took up duck hunting like 3 years ago, and now I'm a pretty big waterfowler, although this year was a pretty tough year for it. And I started saltwater kayak fishing, I guess now it's been, what is it, 10, 12 years ago. And that'll ruin your freshwater fishing really fast when you catch on to that and you realize how exciting that is. So yeah, if it's summertime, I got a rod in my hand, or I'm going to a 3D archery tournament, and during the fall, I'm hunting as much as possible. And in the spring, I'm trying to work in a turkey hunt and spring white bass. And this is a good thumbnail sketch. When we were planning to have children, I had impressed upon my wife that we can't have children. Their birthdays cannot be during hunting season. And I'm already in trouble because my wife is her birthday is in the middle of elk archery season. And I have missed my wife's birthday 2 years ago. I missed her birthday to go elk hunting in Wyoming, and then I got my first bull. So at least we made, if you're gonna go big, if you're gonna be in trouble, go big, go or don't go home. So I had to have a really, sizable birthday present for her to compensate for that. But and even at the office and in work, people all know me as the hunting and fishing guy. So people regularly come by and say, "I'd like to purchase a firearm. How do I do that?" Or "I'd like to go fishing in this area. What should I do?" Or it's gotten around that I'm that guy.
That's not a bad thing. It's so
Yeah,
funny.
no,
I was laughing. For those of you who are watching this podcast back, Chris will be the video you see. But I was laughing because I've had that same conversation with my wife. Now, we don't have kids yet, but I have expressed that there are certain months with which I would like them to not be born.
windows of opportunity. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
Um, but hey, if that's what it happens, and I will find a way and embrace it when it does. I am also in my day job. I am the hunting and fishing guy. Although for me, it's been fly fishing. 2 years ago, my wife and I were in Colorado for our anniversary. We're
Nice.
also
Yep.
A May couple,
Yep.
and we did some trout fly fishing and
Hmm.
got hooked. And I don't think I've picked up a spinning rod since then,
Yeah.
and we really struggled for the first year here in the Austin area, but now that we've sort of figured it out and we've got some spots that we like, we can pretty consistently go out
Yep.
and get something on the fly rod. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. There's some good opportunities over there. Yeah. We used to go to Colorado as a kid every summer to fly fish was our family vacation, like every year.
See, that's something that I want to do. I want to get to that
Yep.
point, but I want to talk a little bit more about your hunting background specifically.
Hmm.
But before we do that, you're the Wild Vittles podcast. What is a vittle? Because I am sure that will confuse as many people as it did myself.
Yeah. I was really worried about, I wanted to choose when I decided to do a podcast and I decided to do it on wild game cooking. I was really concerned about, well, what kind of title can I throw out there to be unique and to grab people's attention? And so I actually utilized my wife because I had some ideas, but she's more creative than I am sometimes. So we were traveling on a long distance trip and we were kind of doing this word play back and forth. She told me all my titles were too long and they need to be more concise. And I think she came up with the Wild Vittles. And we're from Oklahoma. We're from Western Oklahoma, and we still, talk a little country. I'll say it's just kind of a little backwoodsy, in country the way that we talk. And we've always known the term vittles, and vittles mean food. And so, I had to kind of research a little bit. There was a couple things I wasn't exactly sure how you spell it. And there was a big controversy around that. I sent out actually an Instagram poll on that. Do you spell it with a Vittles or Viddles? And that caused a little marital strife in my house because my wife had one opinion, I had another. We went with the TT spelling because that's what I believe on the internet tells me is more factual. It's a cowboy slang term for food. And if you go way back, and if you're familiar with the Beverly Hillbillies as a TV series, it's back in the black and white days. The character Granny would often be preparing a meal, and she would either she would tell the family, or the family would ask Granny, "What kind of victuals you whipping up?" And so, that was another point that this wasn't something just one of our families made up. It was a real term. And I asked a lot of people too, you know what that is? And people look at me funny, like, yeah, I know what that is, but nobody says that. So I wanted something to make people kind of pause and go, oh, okay, food. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely does that. And it's a unique name and it's a memorable one.
That's what I was shooting for.
People ask me questions about Endure Hunt because it's kind of a weird
Hmm.
name also. I wanted it to
Hmm.
be short, I wanted it to be different, and I kind of wanted it to be a little bit confusing because it would make
Yeah.
people question things and make it harder to forget. So I think it ticked all of the boxes, to be honest. I think it's a great
It
name.
does. It does. Yeah. No, I agree.
Before we move on, since we're talking about the podcast, what is your target audience? What's your mission? What are you trying to accomplish with the Wild Vittles
Yep.
podcast?
Yeah, and I appreciate you asking that question because that was the why behind anything I'm doing is very important. Um, we only got so much time. It's one of our most precious resources. And when I wanted to do a podcast, and I was kind of looking at different angles, and I thought, I feel like this area might be underserved because I looked at podcasts and there's not very many wild game podcasts. There's like, depending upon how you count it, three or four counting mine. So I felt like well, that's going to tell me one of two things. Either this is an underserved area or people don't want to listen to it. And so it's a bit of an experiment to see which that is. I think my audience is, anybody that is hunting and fishing and is excited about once they've gotten their, their deer, their duck, their fish, and then they say, now what? What do I do? Or maybe they do know how to make a few dishes, but they want to expand their repertoire. And my real the core, as we'd say in engineering, your root cause. What are you really trying to get to? I want to stop wild game waste because I feel like there's a lot of wild game that gets left in the freezer until the next year, and then we throw it out on a delayed basis because I think people are intimidated by diving in and experimenting with wild game because they feel like it has to be a special dish or handled with special care or can't serve it to your family and only, maybe only you eat it because, they think it's gamey. And I also want to make the word gamey, I want to make it like, we talk about growing up, as like bad is actually good, which was confusing my parents' generation. I want gamey to be cool. I want people to say that's really gamey, and with a smile, like that's an awesome thing because it's really just a taste it's different, and I think people need to expand their horizons around tastes and embrace things for what they are.
Yeah, I agree with that. We're a little bit ahead where I wanted to be. I was planning on asking you what your thoughts on the term gaminess are because I've gone back and forth on that one myself because I've heard people say, like, for example, pronghorn. They're like, "Oh, you can't eat pronghorn," and I'm like, "It's a unique flavor for sure, but I really like it. It's actually
I
one of
do
my
too.
favorite game meats." And when I think about, and don't get me wrong, I appreciate a good beefsteak, but
Yep.
the flavor is different and unique, and that's one of the things that I like about it. It's not the same.
Yep.
Um, Going back to what you're saying though about your mission with the Wild Vittles podcast, I have been that person where, and for me, it wasn't so much that I didn't want to serve it to people. For me, it was a lack of knowing the types of dishes I could eat. I'm pretty boring when
Yep.
I eat breakfast and lunch. I could eat the same thing every day, and for the most part, I
Yeah.
do. But when it comes to dinner, I like to have something different every day.
Hmm.
And I definitely found myself going in the same rotation of we're going to make backstrap this way and we're going to fry, we're going to do like chicken fried, country fried, whatever,
Hmm.
and it gets boring. And
Yep.
that was one of the struggles for me in the beginning. And to some extent, that's still a struggle that I have because I find myself going back to the same couple of recipes. So I've loved the content that you've put out so far. I think that I know we're supposed to be diving into your background, but I just want to say from your video podcast, the way you're doing it, I think is the right way. And I think that it's going to be a good success. I'll be supporting you the whole way along.
I really appreciate that, Andrew. I'm still trying to experiment with what format is appropriate. What I mean by that is long format or short format, because part of me says edit out all the in between and just cut to the chase, right? And, just kind of have boom, 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 you know, next point, next point, next point. But then there's a lot to be learned in the between. So I'm kind of experimenting, and we'll see based on feedback whether or not it needs to be short or long form. But
Mhm.
either way, I enjoy doing this. This is not a money making thing for me at all. This is really just a passion project. And I'm really excited about it's pushing me to learn, and it's also pushing me to meet new people. I mean, like you and I was telling my wife when we set this up, we've actually never spoken. We've just exchanged, messages and emails and things like that. So I'm really looking at, the composition is experiential. I'll put it that way, and expand your network, learn new things.
Yeah, I agree with that. The connections that I've made is one of the surprising things that I wasn't planning on when I started this
Hmm.
podcast. But it's also been one of the most rewarding things because I've met some pretty great people. And we talked about this on your podcast. I haven't technically been doing this a year yet, but when
Hmm.
this podcast comes out, I'll be very close to having done this for a year. And I've already met some pretty great people, and it's great to make those connections and to see and learn from other people. One thing before we go into the background, I know that I've been going down this rabbit hole a little bit, but there's this saying that I really like, and in my job we use Microsoft Teams for like our
Hmm.
chat software, and you can have like a little saying or a quote in your profile. And my saying is, you cannot lose if you never quit. And I say that because I make mistakes all of the time. I get things wrong.
Hmm.
But the reason that I've gotten to where I have today is because I don't give up. I just take all of those as a piece of information that I can use to get better next time. So,
Yeah.
what you were talking about with the feedback loop, the feedback cycle, that is how you
Yep.
succeed. Just keep
Yep.
taking that feedback and keep iterating and moving forward. That's
Yeah.
exactly how I think you should do it. But
I agree.
let's talk hunting a little bit. So,
Yeah.
2018 was when I started Western hunting, and you
Hmm.
have done all sorts of different hunting. But what's your? I guess let's start with your Western hunting background. What
Hmm.
got you into Western hunting, and what are some of the hunts that you've been on?
Yeah. It was a long time coming. So I'll go all the way back to my teenage years when I mentioned that we went to Colorado fly fishing every summer, and I loved shooting a bow. I hadn't in my early teenage years. I hadn't yet taken a deer with a bow. In fact, it was a very foreign concept, and we didn't have many deer in my early days. But I would pick up the magazines, the bow hunter magazines, and I would see these Western hunts. These huge adventures that guys were going out west. And I looked up when I was in Colorado the seasons and when they were, and I'm like, man, when I am in my 20s, I'm going to come out here and do this. And then life happened. And when I was in my 20s, I was, went to university, got married, started to have kids, and I whitetail hunted like crazy. But it wasn't until I would say I had a plan in 2011. I decided this is the year of the elk, and I was doing a blog at the time. Funny enough, declared it year of the elk, and that was in like January when you're setting all your targets for the year. And I got a knee injury that year. I was like, okay, I guess it's not. So my plan B was I ended up going to Alaska and doing a salmon fishing trip, like a DIY. It was extremely fun, and I've done it a couple more times. I'd highly recommend it. They're actually because I'm digressing a little bit, but I got really excited about the salmon fishing, and I looked into it, and I was like, oh my god, this is so expensive to go to some outfit that's going to put you up or fly you out. I've got to find a better way to do this. And on a whim, I think I Googled or looked on Amazon, and there actually is a book called How to Salmon Fish in Alaska on a Budget. And I've read that thing in one night. It's not very long, but I read it one night, and you rent a cargo van that has been converted into something you can sleep in. And you take like a cooler up there and you bring food because food's expensive in Alaska because they ship everything up there, and you catch your fish and you freeze them up there in facilities you find. And I brought a vacuum sealer that runs off a cigarette lighter and then froze them up there. And then you use that cooler to bring the fish home. And wow, that was a great adventure. And then I got shipped overseas for a job. I'm with an oil company and they move us around. So I didn't get back until summer of 2016, and I didn't have a chance to really hunt or fish that fall. So 2017, I was like, I need to figure out what I'm doing. And I kind of made plans that year. And then 2018 was my first hunt. And so, first hunt out of the gate, and I'm a DIY kind of guy, but my first hunt out of the gate I did with an outfitter out of Colorado because I wanted a little help to ensure that I understood how to go out and survive, purify water, make sure I'm not doing something stupid, make sure that I know how to navigate, things like that. And it was not a successful elk hunt. It was a great bow hiking trip. But my guide, he was like a 27-year-old fit ex-Marine who drugged me all over those mountains over there. And I really enjoyed his company. He taught me a lot and validated that, yeah, I can do this. And so that was my very first hunt. But that same year, I had, through Go Hunt, had researched pronghorn hunting and ended up going out to Wyoming and drew a tag in one of those kind of second choice units that don't have a whole lot of public land. Used OnX, found a honey hole. It was wonderful. I mean, we had antelope everywhere. And I was using my crummy old 30-06. I didn't have really good equipment, and I had a duplex scope. If you're familiar with the duplex reticle, I didn't have turrets or anything, and I had sighted into kind of what I knew, was what 100 and 200 were, but on the 300, I kind of had to line up on the post of the duplex where it goes from thin to thick. That was kind of my proxy. and went out there and got a buck and and a doe antelope my very first time out, and that was my first Western big game success. And oh, I was so excited. Antelope hunting is more laid back. You see a lot more animals, and if you're in a good area, your success rates are pretty high. But you've really got to work on, you know, I think you got to do your research in advance, know where you're going. It was extremely crowded, and the research ahead of time really paid off. And doing the work with the rifle to make sure that I could shoot that distance, because where I come from, we shoot 100 yards. And so this long distance game is something that I've really kind of honed over the last 7, 8 years. Now I can shoot out 500 yards, and I've got a 300 Win Mag with turrets that turn, and but it took a while to educate me on that. So that the pronghorn was my first uh, big game animal, and after that I had a few more trips where I would do both like an elk trip and an antelope trip. I don't recommend putting them together at the same time because I still have regret today. I think it was the next year I did a combo, and I'd gotten drawn in Wyoming for an elk hunt, and we went and a big blizzard hit right as we were going in, and I had a buddy that wanted to come with me, not to hunt, but just come with me. And he had a bunch of garage sale type equipment, and he like froze to death. And he was like, "Do we really need to stay out here?" And I mean, we weren't seeing anything, and it's in one of these units that have an early rifle season, and we kind of bow hunted a little bit, and then went to rifle, and all of a sudden, all these orange hats showed up everywhere. And we got pressured out, and we quit the elk hunt and went to antelope hunting. And we ended up getting an antelope that year too, but it still haunts me that I left the mountains early from elk hunting. And but it was a lesson, to your point earlier, that I know myself now. When you go out, and this is some advice for people, and you've probably seen this too. When you go out and you're going to go hunt, especially an elk hunt in the mountains or a mule deer hunt in the mountains, whatever it is, if you're doing a long hike in, you're going to get tired. You're going to get discouraged. You probably aren't going to see as many game animals as you're used to or you think you're going to see. And sometime in the middle of that hunt, you're going to have this question in your mind: what am I doing? Why am I out here? I should just go home. This is ridiculous. And I know that about myself now. And it's not just me. I assure you, everybody else has those thoughts too. And you kind of, if you know in advance, you can kind of plan ahead and go, okay, when that happens, I need to remind myself, I've planned all this time for this. My family wants me to go do this. And you can turn a bad hunt into a good hunt in the matter of 60 seconds when you see something. And then if you're able to convert that, much like, your elk hunt that you told about on your podcast, where, what was it, day 5?
Uh-huh. Yeah, day 5, first and only bull we saw.
Yeah. And so, and it was hard for me too, it wasn't until year 5 that I actually found success. And it's a really funny story I told on Carrie's podcast, but just real quickly, I apply for everything, and all the Western hunts. And what I generally do is I apply for Wyoming, and then I'll apply for other states. And then if I get something in the meantime, I'll withdraw for Wyoming, because Wyoming's the first one you have to put the money in for, but you don't find out until like mid-May. So I went ahead and applied like in end of January. And then I had lined up where I figured out, okay, I think this year I'm going to do a muzzleloader mule deer hunt in Colorado. I had appropriate level of points. I know I'll draw it. And I thought, I'll just withdraw that Wyoming tag, because you can do that up to a certain date in early May. Well, I thought the date was May 9th, and it was actually May 8th that you have to withdraw. And because I procrastinated, I waited too long. And when I went in, they're like, you can't withdraw anything. But I thought, no problem. I have only 2 points in Wyoming, because I'd went, 3 years before that. There's no way I'm going to draw, because you need like 4 points to draw. Well, they also have a special random draw, and I accidentally drew a random tag, which is a happy thing, but you can't refund that. I mean, you're either going to have to break a leg or die is the only way that you're going to get that tag back, or get the money back. And I'm not going to do either one of those things. And Colorado, if you get a draw tag, which I knew I'd already put in, I knew I was going to get it. If you tell them within the week, you can get back both the points and the money. So it was a pretty obvious choice at that point. And so I did not have an outfitter lined up, but the way these things work is, people put in deposits and then they don't draw and there's openings. Well, I called an outfitter that I had heard of and said, "Hey, if you have any cancellations, I accidentally drew a random tag." And they said, "We had 6 cancellations and we would love to have you." So I got signed up on the day that I drew my tag, and turned out to be a wonderful outfitter in Western Wyoming. And first day out, we called in a bull. First, we were walking up, and he was just kind of making little cow sounds. Well, I should back up. In the morning, we found them. We tried to make a move on them. They weren't interested in coming in and kind of moved off. And we decided to stay with them. We stayed with them. They bedded down. Couldn't see them, but we could hear them. We bedded down probably 500 yards away and waited until 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, re-engaged them, and we were making some calls and moving in and never hearing anything yet. And a 5 point snuck in on us and both caught us off guard. And he was facing as a frontal shot. He's a little bit far. He was like 33 yards, and I wasn't comfortable doing a frontal shot at that yardage. A frontal shot I'd want to be pretty close. And then he's wheeled and ran off. And my outfitter, he's like, or my guide, he's like, "You got to be on your toes. Those kind of opportunities come up, and you got to be ready for it." I'm like, "Dude, I was ready, but he's like, "Don't worry about it. I've had situations where this happens, and then another one comes in." And no joke, as soon as he said that, he put up his binoculars and looked in the general direction through the trees and said, "There's another one coming. I'm going to drop back, start calling. You get ready." And I was like, "What? What?" And so like I kind of get into the brush. He gets back behind me and starts calling, and I can see through the trees. I see these hooves just going, and boy, he trots out there and stops perfectly behind a tree that is protecting him from shoulder to midsection. And I'm pulled back at this point because everybody will tell you, don't wait until he steps out to pull back. You got to be ready. So I'm sitting there quivering, just shaking, and finally the guide calls again. He can't see what's happening. I let down. He kind of looks off at the guide, and then he takes a couple steps forward. I pull back, and now he's free and clear. And I'm like, I believe this to be just short of 40 yards. And the last thing I remember before I completely blacked out is getting my 30 and 40-yard pins kind of gapping on him. And when I released, I was like, "Lord, let's let this fly true," because I've been waiting 5 years for this to happen. And he's kind of standing in the shadows, and I can see the arrow gliding through the air, and then bam, he wheels around and he's running down the hill. I can see my arrow sticking out about, where you can see it here, about, I don't know, 18, 20 inches out on the other side, but at a real sharp angle back. And I'm like, this is a good thing. And so he runs off. We both start calling to try to calm him down, and then he's gone. And I talked to the outfitter when he comes up. He's like, "What happened?" I'm like, "I made a shot. I think it was good. I thought he was completely broadside, but the arrow was angled pretty sharply." And he's like, "Okay, well, we'll wait." And I said, "Well, how long we wait?" And he goes, "Well, how long do you want to wait?" I was like, let's give him a full hour." And because normally I wait 30 minutes on a whitetail, but I do not want this dude to get up. That was the longest freaking hour of my life. And I started going over there with my orange, flagging tape and trying to like mark every drop of blood. And he's, the guy'd seen this a lot. So he knows where the point of impact was, the general direction. He walks over the rise and he goes, "Chris, he's right down there." And he had made it about 75, 80 yards. I think he stopped when we were calling him and just laid down right there and bled right out. And he's just a little 5 point, but I'm so stoked because it was just a dream that I've been working on for so long. Everything to come together and to make a great shot on him. And what had happened was he was broadside, but when I released, because he was already kind of a little jumpy, because he's like, "There's something over there and I don't know what it is." When I released, he turned kind of quarter toward me, and my arrow hit perfectly in that vital V. And if it had been an inch and a half further up, it hit the knuckle of the shoulder. It would have been terrible. But I'm using a very heavy arrow. It's like a 535 grain arrow, a 70-pound bow, and that drove. It's an iron well broadhead, drove all the way through him at an angle, kind of 45-degree angle. So it had good penetration and put him down. So that's my big story that really trumps all my others, which are primarily antelope. But I do hope to get back and do a mule deer hunt one of these days, and I want to go down back and go do more elk. I have shot a cow last year in Utah, but it was not nearly as dramatic as this. This is my big experience, you know. So sorry, I went on way too long on that.
No, that's a great story. I mean, that really sets a stage. I've done 3 elk hunts myself, 2 rifle, 1 archery, and the one I
Hmm.
got was rifle. But man, there's something about archery.
Yeah.
I love archery. Calling them in. I got in a bugling match with one when I was in Utah back in
Yep.
2022. There's nothing like it. It's
I agree.
the adrenaline, and then being able to stay composed, waiting that full hour. You know, you did the right thing. It's better to be safe. They're tough creatures, and if you don't watch them go down,
Yeah.
man, you just don't know.
We had good conditions because it was, hit him at 5 o'clock, right? And it's
Hmm.
bluebird sky, and and the sun's not going down for another 3 hours. Like, let's give it another hour.
Yeah, no
There's no danger,
rush,
right?
no weather
Yeah.
pushing you to do anything. You're not
No.
worried.
Yeah.
No, that's perfect. Well, let's take up from there. You know, you've got your elk down, and now we can start talking about processing and everything.
Yep.
I would say both of us agree. You know, there's hunting is fun. The challenge is good. Being able to provide meat is very rewarding. It's the success in hunting, getting that arrow through is only half the journey, and I would argue, particularly with elk hunting, the easier half of the journey because
Hmm.
I'm sure you packed out the way that everyone has to pack out in elk country, multiple trips,
Hmm.
heavy weight on your back, um,
Yep.
and then we get into bringing it home, getting it ready for processing, and you know, I guess while we're on that, you've mentioned the podcast is where you start at. Your mission is you want to stop wasting of wild game. What do you think
Hmm.
fueled this particular passion for you? Why is it the food aspect rather than,
Yeah.
the thrill, the challenge, something else like that?
Yeah. I think, the reason for that is that I think it has to do with my farm background. So I'm used to, there's a heavy connection of food and hunting and fishing for me based on just being raised on a farm. We gardened, and and we would catch fish, and we would eat fish. We would hunt quail. We'd eat quail. And so I've always seen that connection. And I'm one of the big tenets of my life is commitment. And if I tell somebody I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. And so that aggravates my wife sometimes because she'll ask me, will we do this? Can we do this? And I won't say yes until I'm sure. And I'm like, if I tell you yes, it's going to happen. I feel like in hunting, if I take an animal, I have made a commitment that I am going to utilize that animal. And I feel like I've let myself and the animal down if I don't. So that's a big part of it. So and it extends not just utilizing everything that's in my freezer, but it's even taking everything out of the field that I can. So there are certain states that they have I call them wanton waste laws, and they'll specify, well, you at least have to take the quarters. Well, I want to take the neck. You know, I'm not always a big fan of all the internal organs, and it kind of depends on the situation. But on the meat, I'm all over it. And there's some things that I used to do that, like, shanks were not a big thing for me, and now I'm like, oh my god, those are great. Um, Ribs, I've started either sawing the ribs if I can, or doing what I would call as a rib roll. And I think I've seen Jesse Griffiths do it, and there's a really good wild game chef on Instagram, Chris Abigail. I've seen her do it as well, where you kind of go in between the ribs in one continuous piece, and you kind of roll it up. So there's more than one way to skin a cat, and I think it's up to us to utilize as much. And so I'm extremely proud when I look back at a carcass and there's nothing left but the spine and the head and the skin. You know what I mean? It's like, and the hooves, because I want to carry all that with me and take it back.
Yeah, I love that. Respecting the animal. The rib roll is one that I want to try. I was always skeptical of ribs when I first started on my wild game
Yep.
journey, and I used to just turn it in the ground. And then one day,
Yep.
I don't know if I got it from his cookbook or if I saw him do it online. I know Steve Ranella has a rib recipe, and
Hmm.
I did it once. I was like, dang, these are actually really good.
Yeah.
And I've wanted to do the rib roll, and archery is my preferred hunting method, I guess, my method of
Yep.
take. But I've done mostly rifle the last few years. And the downside of using a rifle is if you have a really well placed shot, there's usually some meat
Yeah.
loss. So my
Yep.
ribs have tended to not be salvageable. And same thing for some of the shoulder meat. Usually I lose some of that. But
Yeah.
whenever I can, I save the rib meat because it's good. It really is good.
Yeah. I think you're really smart to do that, though. I mean, because if you use lead ammo, and I do, you got to worry about that fragmentation of lead. So I want to get on to copper or kind of the non-toxic shot, but I've got a hell of a lot of ammo I need to go through first before I get there. But I understand the why.
Well, the interesting thing is, I tried monolithics once on accident because I needed some ammo and I was out. And
Hmm.
I always buy them in minimum of 100, even if I'm going to
Yep.
do,
I think it's
well,
smart.
once I pick a load, I buy it in minimum of 100. I
Yeah.
have a convoluted process for picking out my rounds that I'll talk about on another podcast. But once I'm committed to a particular load, I buy at least 100 because I do a
Hmm.
lot of shooting in preparation. And this one season, I want to say it was actually a Sig Sauer load, and it was monolithic copper.
Hmm.
The retention on those is fantastic. They really do retain a lot, but they're much more expensive. And I've tried a few different ones since then, and they don't shoot as well as the bonded
Hmm.
bullets that I usually shoot, which is the problem. You've got to
Mm.
get a good load, and it has to really like your gun. But
Yeah.
anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
Talking about food, right? Were you always a cook? How did you get your interest in food? Is it something that you were always drawn to?
I, you know, it started kind of like I was saying earlier about out of obligation. I've always been interested in food, but I didn't grow up cooking. It wasn't until kind of I would say my early 20s. I'm trying to think. I think I was 20 when I got my first buck with my archery equipment. Was my first deer was when I was 14 with a rifle, but my first archery buck was when I was 20, and I think that's when I got really serious about the food aspect of it because I was in college, and food is important as a college student. I had to, I was living in an agricultural fraternity, if you can believe that, and we didn't have a freezer that they would allow me to keep the meat in. But I had a professor friend that I asked him. I was like, "Hey, if you would allow me to put my deer meat in your freezer," he kind of lived out in the countryside. "I would be more than happy if you were to use as much as you wanted of it as charge for me using your freezer." And he's like, "We would like that." And so that allowed me to have access to a freezer while I was a university student, and I started doing some cooking at that point. And I view cooking as kind of like a project, and I like projects. So, and a bit of experimentation as well. But at first I started out like everybody else of like, well, you have to use a deer recipe for a deer, or I do deer steaks and things like that. And because I was a university student, I was using a processor to do everything. And I think there are very good wild game processors out there that do a very good job. I think there's some processors that are used to only doing cattle, and they apply the same methodology to the deer, and I don't think they do it as well. Um, that was just my experience. So I am not in any way disparaging professional butchers because there are people out there that know their craft and do a very good job at it. So it evolved, and my wife would sit here with me if she was with me and tell you, Chris's cooking was not very good when we first got married. I did a poor job of it. I overcooked my steaks, didn't really understand the principles around it being lean. It was bad. I could make really good chili, and we'd make a few other things, kind of basic, but my repertoire was extremely limited. And it's really been, I would say, over the course of probably the last 10 or 12 years that my game has really improved. And I'll credit all the resources that are out there. I mean, Hank Shaw is one of my heroes. He's a fantastic cook. I know Steve Ranella has been probably instrumental in bringing the hunting and fishing scene and probably the food scene to a wider audience, but I don't find their recipes to be as good. And what I mean by that is when you read a recipe from Hank, he gives you the nuances. He tells you what's important. I feel like if he's done that, it's something he's really done, and he's kind of imparting to you some really good wisdom. Not taking anything away from the meat eater crew, because I know they test their stuff too, but I feel like it's kind of a little more refined. And there's other people out there. Jesse Griffith's great, and there's this lady I want to have on my podcast named Christy Crabtree, and she's got a cookbook. She's called Nevada Foodies, and most beautiful food photography you'll ever see. And she has a knack as well. Some people are just kind of artists about this, and I'm not really a good artist, but I'm really stubborn, and I'll keep trying until I get it right.
Yeah, me too. I'm definitely stubbornness works really well for me, and I'm a bit of a perfectionist, which I think that would probably be my wife's number one complaint about when I cook. She'll think it's the best dish I've ever made, and I'm like, no, I could have done this
Yep.
better. This seasoning wasn't
Yep.
quite right, and the char
Yep.
isn't exactly the way it should have been.
Yep. Yep.
Always nitpicking every little thing that I do.
Every meal, she would tell you that I think is going to be a disaster midway through. I'm like, the Domino's emergency pizza that they talk about on TV. I'm like, oh, we're
Yeah.
gonna have to get an emergency pizza. I don't think this is gonna work.
That was the conversation my wife and I had when we were making that hog that we got from Carrie's place our first time. Like been here 4 years. Every time I've tried to shoot a hog, they've never shown up until my
Yep.
wife is the one who's going to like the one who's behind the gun. Which
Yep.
I'm happy for her. I'm like happy we finally got a hog. But we went to go
Yep.
cook, and I was like, if this doesn't work out, Domino's is 15 minutes away.
Yep.
Not proud of it. We did eat it, but I do the same thing. It's so funny. I always think it's going to be a nightmare, especially when I'm trying something for the first time. There's a couple of recipes
Yes.
that I'm comfortable with now. And I'm like, yeah, unless something goes really wrong, I'll be happy with you eating this. Chances are I'm still going to find something to complain about,
Yeah.
though. So before we dive into the like hunter wild game 101
Mm-hmm.
thing that I'd love to do, I wanted to
Sure.
ask when you're in the field and you've got an animal down, what's your philosophy towards how you're going to use it? Are you thinking already about the meals that you want to make with it? Or is it something that you're like, I'm just going to quarter this up, debone it, get it home, and figure it out
Mm-hmm.
then?
Yeah. When I'm in the field, my focus is on getting it cool, keeping it dry, then getting it cold, and keeping bugs off of it because I'm often hunting in warm type temperatures. And I'm not really thinking just yet in the field about the end product because, keeping it clean is so important and it's so damn hard. If you're whitetail hunting or hog hunting or whatever kind of more like in, a natural setting where it's not in the mountains of the West, generally you can hang stuff up. It's easier to keep it clean. And you've got more, amenities at your disposal, ice and ice chests. But when you're, like even the antelope hunt, which you think, yeah, you're truck camping. Well, we were in a place where we couldn't drive to where the antelope was because you can only stay on the 2-track, right? So even that one, we did the gutless method on it, and it was a booger keeping that hair off of that meat because it's real brittle, and there's a real, I mean, the finer points will make a big difference. Cut with the grain of the hair. Don't cut against the grain of the hair. The only place you got to be cutting across the hair is on the legs, when you're doing like the ends of the shanks or cutting around the knees. Those little things make such a difference. And over the years, if you pay attention, you'll begin to pick up on those things, and your end result will be much better. And keeping it cold and dry is really important. And you and I talked about this before, and coincidentally, we have the same method is frozen gallon jugs of water. I get a really poor result if I throw meat into an ice bath in a cooler. Yes, it'll be cold. I don't have to worry about it rotting, but it will be gray, and all that meat will be washed out and tasteless until you get kind of down where the water doesn't penetrate. But meat that I've put in game bags and then put in a cooler with ice jugs comes out beautiful generally. And then I do an extra step and I'll age. And I've had mixed results on aging. I'm impatient and I generally have a short window of opportunity to be able to do my processing. So that kind of guides how long I'll age. But I like to put then my quarters into a refrigerator, like a drink fridge, a spare fridge. You have to have a very understanding spouse or partner that will allow you to do that. You might say, well, I can't get it all in. I, no joke, got that 5 point bull elk into a refrigerator. It was a tight fit, but it went in. I didn't think it was going to go in. And if you can give it a few days in there, it really helps. Another thing I should back up is if you can let that meat hang, even if it's just a quarter hanging on a tree or something, even an elk, in the wind in a cool area, it will kind of take on this hard, kind of a tough skin on the outside, unless you got flies around and you need to get it put up. And that is kind of a protective barrier. And all that makes it much easier than when you get it, either to the processor or you process it yourself. Getting the dirt and hair and stuff off like that is a whole lot easier. When I do get to the point that I process, and I process myself now, I do. I didn't always do it, but I've done it probably for the last, I don't know, 15 years or so. It's at that point that I'm thinking about what I want to do with this. And I've learned over the years what I what I do more of, and I do more ground meat. All the steaks I'll use. I do a lot of ground dishes because it's not because I love ground meat. It's because ground meat is accessible, approachable, flexible. I can defrost it quickly. I can have it in sizes of packages that vary from 1 pound, pound and a half to 2 pounds. And I actually measure out a mix of those. I can put different fat ratios in them. Sometimes I have no fat. Sometimes I put 20% fat in. And I mark all those and put those in different places in my freezers. But the roasts and the shanks and things like that, shanks I think are better to cook at shanks than burger because you have so much loss in the process, and it's a real pain in the ass to go and cut those things up.
Yeah.
Roasts, I generally keep one hind quarter for roast, and I'll keep a few roasts, and then I'll also do like chicken fried steaks, and I'll do those out of a back ham. It really is at that point. It's unless I'm really jonesing to do some certain recipe because I'm always looking at recipe books. I mean, if the people on the video can see me, I got a whole row of recipe books back here, and I really geek out on the internet too. I've got a whole stack of printouts of recipes as well that I'm always printing out. I need to put in a binder. If I've got something like that that requires a certain cut, I would keep it. But pretty much, I've got my regimen down of all the steaks out of the back straps, one hind quarter being roast, one hind quarter ground. I do keep my front shoulders intact as long as it's not like bloodshot, because I do enjoy shoulder roast, blade roast. Every once in a while, I'll make a flat iron steak out of the blade roast if the animal's big enough. Like an elk, a blade roast is pretty cool.
Oh yeah. I'm a big fan of a bone-in, slow-cooked blade roast. If you do it right,
Yep.
it's very good.
Yep.
So you've got your process down. One of the things that I think is worth reiterating that you mentioned is that you've learned over time what you eat and you've tailored your processing to that. And when you had me on your podcast, I said the same thing. Over time, I've learned what
Yep.
we're going to use, what's going to sit in the freezer
Yep.
for a long time. And I think that the takeaway from that people listening should have is you're going to figure out what you use, what you don't use, what you like, what you don't like. Just adjust over time. It's a learning process. You
Yep.
don't have to do one thing and then always stick to it. But while we're talking about, in Deer Hunt Podcast, my audience is new hunters, generally speaking. Do you recommend they go to a processor first? They process it themselves? How should someone who's new that's never done it before approach it?
I think it really depends. It's a personal choice, and it depends upon your own comfort level. There are tremendous resources out there now to learn how to do it yourself. I don't look down on anybody that wants to go to a processor, because I think at the end of the day, my goal is utilization and good utilization, and you can certainly do that with processor. And not everybody's built the same. Some people want to have their hand in every single process, and others are like, you know, they're maybe it's your time of life as well. I can assure you that I struggled when my children were small to have time to do all that, right? Because it's a different season of life. If you do want to do it, what I would say is allow plenty of time. I would also recommend if you have access to a friend that knows how to do it, that's the best way. Is just really kind of either learning together or having someone come over and kind of step you through it. But it is, I think, self-explanatory once you kind of break through the initial concern that you learn the muscle groups, and the muscle groups you just kind of find your way through it. I mean, if you've seen a video on how to take apart a hindquarter, all it really is breaking down the muscles into the different groups, and they kind of you kind of put your fingers in there and pull them apart, and there they are. There is a misconception my mother and my wife had, that when you do that, there's a tremendous amount of blood. There is not. It's actually quite clean and quite straightforward, and I find it an interesting anatomy lesson as well. But I should also explain, people may have a misconception that they see either steaks from the butcher or they've seen videos of like domestic animals being butchered. They do a bone-in processing, and what most people, I would recommend people do, and what I do is a boneless method. Now there are some exceptions to that, like if you're going to do a shank. You had mentioned to me, Andrew, that you like to do, or you used to like to do a neck roast with the bone in. There are different ways to do that. Some people want a tomahawk steak and leave that rib on. That's cool too. But by and large, generally speaking, you remove the bones. And again, exceptions to it. And there are good things to use with the bones, is making stock, which I'm still a stock novice.
Oh, I love making
It generally
stock.
has to do with time. I am my first batch that I made, I had not enough bones and too much water, and it was weak. So I think I'm gonna do it again when I have time, and it's all about time. Is if you got all the time available and you've got room in the freezer, but stock is a project that's going to take multiple days. I think, in my mind, anyway.
Yeah, I've wasted many bones in the beginning of making stock. I kind of have it
Yeah.
figured out. Unfortunately for me, because of time, I am pushing my envelope a little bit, and I have one of those instant pots, and you can pressure cook.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is, I haven't seen anyone make a good wild game stock in a pressure cooker. So what you end up doing is
I've
looking
never
at,
heard of that.
well, yeah, if you look up instant pot stock, you can see it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's supposed to make the process quicker. People will do it with chicken stock and other things. I've tried to do it with wild game, and
Mm-hmm.
none of them have came out right. But the problem is I like to experiment and try it, so I inevitably waste the bones learning what not to do. But I love making stock. I keep all of the like the hindquarter bones. The shanks are wonderful for making stock. You
Mm-hmm.
break them open, braise them
Mm-hmm.
under the oven and everything, and it's once you have an idea, it's so much better than store bought stock.
How do you store your stock? Do you store it in jars or plastic?
I do it in jars. So I have
Yeah.
also lost some because of breaking jars. So I have learned the appropriate amount of headspace that I should have. And
Yeah.
then I seal them up and let them sit in the freezer until I'm ready to use
Cool.
them.
I got to do that. I got to do more of that.
I love doing it. It's great. So they get it home, right? And for those listening, if you are intimidated by processing but you're interested, I'm going to drop a bunch of links for YouTube videos that I can find that I have personally used when I was learning how to process, and some newer versions of those videos. So there should be a lot of really great links in the show notes for this, or the YouTube description if you're watching this on YouTube. But when we're talking about wild game cooking for beginners, what are some of the common mistakes that people make that they should try and avoid when they're making their meals?
Yeah, I think one of the most important pieces of equipment that you can get is a thermometer, a meat thermometer. The most common mistake, and there's a variant of this, is people have either cooked things too long or not enough. And what do I mean by that? If it's deer steak, don't overcook it. Don't do it well done, because you're gonna have that steak that somebody, the reason that people think deer is gamey is because they've eaten a steak that's dry and it's just like a piece of boot leather. You really ought to be cooking that to like a medium rare, 135 degrees, seasoned lightly, and especially if it comes out of a backstrap or a tenderloin. If you're doing something like a shoulder, um, you need to cook it a long time, and there's not a good way to really get around that. It's just it takes a long time to cook those tougher cuts and make them tender. But when you hit that, and it's kind of like doing, I don't know if you smoke meat and barbecue and things like
Mm-hmm.
that, but I'm a student in that area too, and if you're doing a pork shoulder, although there's a tremendous amount of fat in that, you've got to hit that, 188, 200, 202, so that all that connective tissue just kind of like melts. And then you've got this wonderful, soft, tender cut that is just really so enjoyable. So time and temperature are very important in ensuring that you understand kind of the windows there, and then just I think understanding that it doesn't have to be You don't have to use a special recipe. You have to be aware of what the cut is and what it is not. There is not much, if any, intramuscular fat. So beef, you hear about marbling and the fat's like intertwined in the muscle. For most wild game animals, it's extramuscular, so it's outside. And quite frankly, the deer fat is like this tallow and it's waxy and it's just not very good in cooking. And so generally you're trying to get that all out. So you have an extremely lean product. So it's much like cooking turkey. You wouldn't cook a turkey and a ribeye steak that's well marbled like a wagyu the
Hmm.
same way. You're going to get
Yeah.
two different outcomes. So I think those are probably the key things.
Okay. So number one tips are paying attention to the cuts you're using because you need to be careful with how you're cooking them. Don't overcook them. Probably number one, and you verify that by using a thermometer and adding some form
Mm-hmm.
of external fat to make up for the lack of fat that you have generally on wild
Yep.
game. What other tips do you think are worth sharing for new cooks that are just starting out?
I think just the awareness that different cuts of a deer or an elk are going to taste different. I'll make a parallel for my duck hunting journey, which I'm still probably in the first. I don't know, it's my third or fourth year. I didn't realize until I shot a few ducks. Not all ducks are the same, and they taste very different. And you need to cook them differently. Well, it's the same thing for your deer meat or your elk meat or your antelope meat. There's a reason everybody loves backstraps. They make a tremendously fantastic steak. Certain cuts out of the back hams have different characteristics. The shoulders have different kind of muscle structure, as do the neck. Do a little research on the internet, and it's not that hard to find things these days, and play to the strengths of those cuts, and put them in recipes that lend to those characteristics. It's kind of like people; we're all different, but we all can't be a tennis superstar. So don't try to make like uh, you know a neck meat slice into a steak that you're going to serve to somebody and think it's going to be really tender. Um, at the same point, you probably could take a backstrap and use it for some of the things that you would for others, but it won't. It's a bit of a waste. And I don't think it'll shred as good. I mean, if you tried to take a backstrap and like do a long cook and shred it into tacos, you probably get a lot finer grained shreds. I don't know. That's just kind of a bit of a wild cooking sin. But I think just understanding play to the strengths of the cuts specifically, and there's good information out there on what to use for. And I even use references to domestic meats in the names for those cuts, and then in C, well, even in a beef cattle, what would you use? The eye of round for or the top sirloin.
Yeah, that's smart. It takes a little bit of effort, but truthfully, learning how to cook takes some effort. You can start by following some specific recipes, and if you really want to learn and get better at it, you've got to start to understand it. So, closing us out now, what are some, if someone were to listen to this podcast or listen to one of yours and say, "Hey, Chris, I got my first deer this season. I haven't cooked any of it yet. What are some recipes that should consider?"
I would start out, I call them foundational. You might call them simple, but I think, some things you can't go wrong on are like a lot of the ground meat recipes. Doesn't matter if you have fat in it or not on these. So, a good deer chili is fantastic. There's a million ways to make a good deer chili. It's hard to screw that up. And you need to make it in a manner you like it. Do you like it spicy? Do you not? The other one is a really good deer steak. And if you can cook a good beef steak, the only difference I think on a good deer steak is your window of when it's right is shorter because there's less fat in that. Hot tip though, that if you are going to do a deer steak and you've done it the right amount and you're comfortable that the interior is the right temperature, sometimes the outsides will still seem a bit dry. And a way to get around that, and you have to kind of move the meat off of the direct flame if you're grilling it, is to take a small pat of butter and put that on that steak and let it melt. And that'll kind of re-moisten, that exterior of that meat. Now, don't tell your calorie counting spouse if they're like, oh my god, you put butter on that, but it'll turn out pretty good. Another way to do it, which I've actually done a video on, is sous vide. And the thing I like about sous vide, people don't know what that is essentially it's a heating element in water that you can dial to a certain temperature. And then you can just take that steak and put it in just a Ziploc bag, get all the air out. And I season the meat and put a little bit of olive oil in the bag with it, not a lot, just a little bit, and submerge it in that water. And the beauty of a sous vide, and restaurants use it like this too, is you can get the meat to the temperature. And let's say you set it for 130, 135. You can leave it there for hours and it's not going to burn. It's not going to overcook. It stays at that temperature. And the beauty is if you're like, let's say you're entertaining guests or something like that, and you're not exactly sure when you're going to cook, you could have everything ready, the steaks anyway. And when you're ready to eat, pull them out, throw them on a cast iron skillet and sear them real quick. And you've got kind of a nice crust on the outside and you've got that perfectly pink center. And you'll have a damn good steak that would rival, I think, anything you'd find in the steakhouse that's beef, if it's a good cut, coming from the backstrap or the tenderloin.
I think those are great recipes to try for those who are getting started. I know that we hit our hour, and I wanted to just thank you for coming on the podcast. I know we only touched the wave tops of wild game cooking, preparation, processing. You've got a lot of great content out there. So where can people connect with you and Wild Vittles?
Yeah, so anywhere podcasts are, Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all the others, I'm on there as Wild Vittles. I have a YouTube channel as well. It's Wild Vittles Podcast. You do have to put the podcast in there because there is another channel that's Wild Vittles for foraging, but they haven't put any content out since 2016. So if you arrive there, not in the right place, put podcast in there and you'll see my smiling face. And then I've got an Instagram account, which is also Wild Vittles Podcast. And I post a lot of the same information there. That's also a good place to get a hold of me, to DM me there if you have any questions or any comments. And I ask people, look, when you're doing your own cooking, tag me and I'll post up in my stories. I really enjoy seeing other people. I'm curious, and I know I'm not, like the pinnacle expert in this area. And there are people doing interesting things, and I like to share it. I like to learn from others. So hope to have some engagement there as well. And Andrew, let me thank you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed the conversation. The time has flown really fast, and really enjoyed talking to you. And I hope it's not the last time. I know hopefully we'll continue to cross paths.
Oh, I definitely intend on having you back on. I could do. To be honest, I looked at the clock and I'm like, man, I could definitely keep going. We'll have you back on. That's all that means is that we'll just have to come back
Cool.
on, talk some more in the future. I'm definitely going to share your links and all of the resources in the show notes so people can connect with you. Absolutely. And to all those that are listening, Chris already said it, but time is our most valuable resource. And I don't take it for granted that you chose to spend it with us today, listening to this podcast, watching this podcast. I hope you learned something. And we'd love to hear from you, either Chris or myself. He's at the Wild Vittles Podcast, and I'm at Endurhunt, ENDURHUNT. Please reach out, connect with us, share this episode. We would love to hear from you. And we'll see y'all next time.